This is
Cast.
Hello there, and welcome to a brand new episode of my podcast, Podcast Racing. Today with me, I have a very special friend who actually hasn't been on the podcast before, but like me, she is a big movie fan. Please welcome my good friend, Roxy. How are you doing, Roxy?
Hey, I'm doing okay. So,
Gotcha.
yeah, I'm excited to be on the podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on as well. And I mentioned before that, like me, you're also a big fan of movies. And I want to ask you, why do you love movies so much, and what got you into film in the first place?
Gosh, yeah, I love film and everything. I'm a film major, so that's kind of what I'm planning to do. I guess I've just kind of always been into films. Like, my parents worked in the industry, like, when I was younger, and then stopped. But like, anytime I'd watch movies with my dad, he'd be like, oh, this is how they filmed this, or this is how, like, certain things like within this work. And that sort of always fascinated me. And then like later I kind of got into theater, and I'm like, I like acting and I love the technical elements of it, and I like film as a medium of storytelling. It's like one of my favorite art mediums. So
That's really cool. Do you mind if I ask what your parents did in the film industry?
yeah, sure. They were extras mostly. I don't know. My mom got into like some directing. They'd work on like movies or plays. They were just like around Hollywood in the 80s, just doing a bunch of temp work in the film industry.
That's cool. That's pretty cool. Yeah, just like you, I was also a film major, and I basically have been into movies for as long as I can remember. I vividly remember watching the Star Wars movies as kids, and just falling in love with this universe, and just loving film as a visual medium, especially. Personally, I love movies where the story is communicated more so visually rather than through strictly through the dialogue.
Yeah, and you mentioned Star Wars. Like, the people say a lot about the prequels, but like the Phantom Menace really made me love costumes.
That's pretty cool. So yeah, I love movies so much, but I don't love everything about the history of movies, and even today, but
No.
more so in the past, I guess. There's been a lot of quote unquote censorship in movies in the film industry. There was a time where back in the olden days of cinema, you couldn't even show like kissing on screen, or you had to be like really brief about it. But now, I mean, this isn't a movie, but like they in like Game of Thrones, all the stuff that they basically can show anything on there, really.
Yeah.
And yes, and basically, movies and just media in general has come a really long way. And do you think that like cinema and media has gotten better or worse?
Ooh, that's a difficult question. Well, in terms of like censorship, it's going in an interesting direction for sure. And there's always like waves of like, we can show this, but then like later on, it's like, ooh, we got to pull that back or show more later, like kind of thing. So I think we're at an interesting place censorship wise. Like, a lot of it we hear like within like big blockbusters for sure. They're like, we can't show this because we can't sell it in other markets, kinds of things, versus like at the same time you have like Game of Thrones on HBO, and HBO's like, yeah, we want something special that you won't see anywhere else. And there's so many, I want to say, like, avenues to like put film media, so you have like TV shows, films, whereas like you get like your big blockbusters or your like small indie movies that can show like different things. But then like even that, like with the modern MPAA, and that's where we get our ratings. So it's like, you get something, if it's rated PG-13, you can show it, you can distribute it a lot more places than something that's going to be like rated NC-17.
When it comes to the MPAA, I have a very love-hate relationship with the MPAA because, yeah, I feel like I don't know. Because the MPA, a lot of people don't realize or even think about this. The MPAA, behind the MPAA are people like you and me,
Yeah.
people with different tastes in different tastes in movies, different tastes in genres, whatever. And it's basically people deciding, what gets rated what. And I feel like the line is getting blurred a little because, like, usually in PG-13 movies, you can only allow up to one F word in a non-sexual context, but there have been instances where an F word in a sexual context or multiple F words were allowed in a PG-13 movie because the director of said movie was able to make an appeal to the MPAA, and they were like, yeah,
Hmm.
sure. And the R rating, even though I know that the R rating, is there to, basically not censor, but basically warn, I guess,
Hmm.
families at least about not going to see this movie or being really cautious about seeing this movie. But I don't know. I see there have been times where I went to the theater to see a rated R movie, and parents would still bring their kids in anyway, either due to not realizing like what exactly is in the movie, or like they just are really frugal with what they can show their kids. And I don't know. Growing up in a very, for lack of a better term, sheltered environments where I grew up in a Christian family, so and my parents instilled in me a certain standard for like what is okay and what isn't okay, and so based off of what I was shown, I guess, growing up, I don't know. Nowadays, I'm watching like a lot more rated R movies, and I feel like the line is getting blurred a little because, like,
Hmm.
there are movies like Midsommar or The Lighthouse, which are R rated, but in my opinion, show stuff that in my opinion, or at least what I was taught growing up, should only be shown in like NC-17 or
Hmm.
X-rated films. So I don't know. Maybe it's just because of what I was taught or what I was shown growing up, but I don't know. I feel like with the MPAA, I feel like many times it gets swayed a little too easily, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I think honestly, there's some progression. Like, I think societally, we accept different things than we would have accepted in the past. Um, but with the MPA, like you were saying, like it's people. It's supposed to be like a revolving panel of people who review these movies, send back notes to like the filmmakers, and are like, we're rating it this because of this. And a lot of times, if it's sometimes like a lot of money behind the project, so like a bigger blockbuster, they're able to work with them more, just if that's like a bias based on like, oh, I know this studio, they can do this. Or if it's like a indie movie that doesn't like have a lot of like a big studio behind it, they seem to have more trouble getting things through the MPAA. There's an interesting documentary about it called This Film Is Not Yet Rated, that kind of like goes into depth about what sort of things they're censoring, and like people getting things through and people not being able to get things through, and like how that's affecting the way the movies can be distributed.
I've heard of that documentary
Mm-hmm.
actually, and I've only seen one clip of it where
Yeah.
there's this actress Maria Bello.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the movie that she was in, but basically, well, she was in the documentary. I think I haven't seen the whole documentary, just like one clip, and she was talking about a movie that she was in with William H. Macy and Alec Baldwin, and she
Mm-hmm.
says that in that movie, like her, privates were shown, so the MPAA, gave it an X rating, and Maria Bello is
Mm-hmm.
basically complaining that, that they were being a bit harsh, and it really should have just gotten an R rating. And personally, I disagree with Maria Bello, and I don't know if it's like again a cultural thing, like the way I was raised, but I don't know. To me, like like showing showing privates, like I think that in my opinion warrants above an R,
Mhm.
and it does bother me a little. Like it does get uncomfortable when I watch a PG-13 movie with my parents, but then we see a butt or something like
Mhm.
that, and it's just like, oh, or like something that in our opinion is like more violent than what should be in a PG-13 movie. And I don't know if that's just because of the Christian, growing up in a Christian family, but I don't. It's I don't know. Like the MPAA again, it's kind of a love-hate relationship that I have with
Yeah. So yeah, it makes it difficult to like judge what's going to be in with movies. So it's like, can I watch this with my mom? Or like, you wouldn't want to watch like a 50 Shades of Grey with your mom,
Oh
right?
gosh. No,
No.
no.
So it's like, how much is going to get through this PG-13 movie? And it's all based on taste of the people who are rating it. Because there's no really set rules. Like before the 1980s, like Gremlins was the first film that was rated PG-13. They didn't have a PG-13 rating back then. And it's
Right,
just because
right.
of like one violent scene. They're like, this is too violent for G, but it's not quite R worthy.
I remember reading somewhere that the Indiana Jones, the second movie, the Temple of Doom,
Mm-hmm.
Doom, that movie has a lot of violent stuff in it, but that movie is rated PG. And
Yeah.
at the time, parents went to see it with their kids, and the kids saw, the guy rip the other guy's heart out and
Yeah.
all this like cult stuff. And parents and kids and parents are horrified by that, and parents are complaining that uh, yeah, that it's too, graphic for PG. And so Spielberg actually proposed, Steven Spielberg, who directed it, actually proposed to the MPAA, why not make a whole new rating? So that's how the PG-13 rating was formed. And yeah, and like you said, Gremlins was the
Yeah.
first, I think it was, yeah, I think it was Gremlins, the first movie to get the PG-13 rating. But again, here's this is interesting. It kind of contradicts what I said before, but in my opinion, Gremlins is too tame for a PG-13 rating. Like
Like it,
there's graphic stuff that happens in Gremlins, but in my opinion, it would have been fine if that movie was just rated PG.
yeah, exactly. It's like, because our perception of what's appropriate or not has changed since the 80s. It's like, I think the scene that they rated it PG-13 based off of is the one with the gremlin in the blender.
Yeah,
And it's like, it's a puppet and we don't really register that. We know it's fake, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
like in the 80s, that was kind of like the height of practical effects. And it seemed more violent if you're watching it in the 80s versus watching it now.
Yeah, and all yeah, no, definitely. But also, I guess there's an age difference as well. If you're a
Yeah.
kid who's just discovering films, and let's say that if you're a 7-year-old who's only watched like Disney movies or whatever, and then your
Mm-hmm.
first like more mature film is Gremlins, I can understand why to a kid like that, Gremlins would be a bit too, much.
Yeah.
It again, like it's interesting to look at like ratings through a cultural and age perspective, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of cultural stuff, actually, so like we mentioned before, like like there was a time, like I mentioned before, there was a time when like kissing and stuff was censored, but also
Mm-hmm.
censored was homosexuality, transsexual stuff was censored, and all this stuff was censored in the name of family values. And I want
Yeah.
to ask you if all this like quote unquote like censorship or like not showing it in media, in films back in the day and today in other countries. Do you think that they were right to do that, or do you think that there is like that is like real like bigotry? There's real prejudice and bigotry behind that, and that they were wrong for uh, censoring or not showing this stuff even in the olden days?
So what it is back in early days of Hollywood, or Hollywood's golden era, really, you had the motion picture production code, or colloquially known as the Hays Code. It was sort of self-imposed on the movie industry. They self-imposed it on themselves because there was sort of a rise in, I guess you can root it in the temperance movement, which was sort of a movement in the 20s, and it's why we had like prohibition and stuff, where everyone's like, we have to be more temperate, less sex violence and alcohol and drugs and anything like that. And so that became a popular idea, like culturally in America. And in that time, kind of like later in the 30s, you had this court case that was saying we're not really sure if films are going to be protected under the First Amendment. I can't remember the name of the case, but when that happened, the film industry was like, oh no, the government might start censoring us. We need to censor ourselves. So you get a very strict set of rules with the Hays Code. And you're asking if I think it was wrong, like censoring sort of like a whole medium of art under the guise of family values, or like a certain set of morals, or a certain people's perceptions of set of morals. In general, I'm going to disagree with censoring art. I think the Hays Code has a very complicated history that's very interesting to talk about, and I don't know if it was the best idea for them to voluntarily go under this self-censorship thing, but like it's the only thing they sort of could come up with at the time. And so if the government had come up with censorship, I would have also thought that was bad. But so again, it's like very complicated, because if you want to censor something because you don't want something shown, or like a group of people don't want something shown, they don't have to see it, right?
Exactly.
That's like a possibility. And it's like, I don't know, it's something like early Hays Code, like Bride of Frankenstein. A lot of people didn't like certain things that were going on with Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster for like various reasons. And I mean, we could go into depth of that, but that would take like hours to just unpack Bride of Frankenstein on itself. But like, again, like not everyone has to see it, and like certain things are made for certain audiences. So I don't really ever think censorship's the right option.
So it's interesting, my thoughts on censorship in general, because like I mentioned before, I grew up in a very in a Christian household, and yet at the same time, well, most Christians in America, at least, or it seems like most Christians in America are conservative, but I'm more liberal. So I'm in more agreements with liberal principles like LGBT rights and all that stuff. And so it's weird with me, because I'm okay with, like I agree with conservatives more in general about, like not showing stuff to kids, like, gratuitous sex, violence, and all that stuff. So in my opinion, censoring that kind of stuff is okay. But when it comes to like forbidding mainly in other countries, but I guess sometimes in America here, even nowadays too, like forbidding like editing out homosexual scenes where homosexuality is even implied, or or maybe if a filmmaker is being bigoted or prejudiced and against homosexuality, but even if even if he or she is not saying it outright directly, even if they're implying it through a film, I think that's wrong. Like I think it's wrong. Like even if you're implying something or symbolically saying something, it might be, okay in the minds of like the MPAA, but I think that that's still wrong. And I think, I think it's weird that like all these other countries, these foreign markets, that in those countries, they don't think it's okay to, like show like like, you know, homosexual stuff or, you know, all that, where I think it's fine as long as, again, like, I understand, like, for really little kids, like, if you don't want to show them a movie with a gay sex scene, that's fine. But
Yeah, I mean,
if you're forbidding a kid from seeing a movie with anything gay in it at all, then that is what I think is
mhm.
wrong.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, it's like I was saying about different audiences in mind. Like if you're gonna make something for children, you probably don't want gratuitous sex and violence in it anyway. But that being said, there's certain things like, say, homosexuality that in context is appropriate for children. Like kids have gay parents, they know their gay uncle, they might be gay themselves. It's like something like that. Like during the Hays Code that came into effect during the 30s, like the American ideal of like adolescents and children sort of thing wasn't in existence as we know it today. And there wasn't much media for children in the same way there is today. So it's like now we're going to have like markets for like children's movies, like Disney films and stuff. But like Snow White came out in the 30s, and that wasn't necessarily for children in the same way a Disney film is for children today. So that's something to consider, like looking at the history of films, because you have things in Snow White. It's a bit like people say that like Disney movies are dark, like the hero's parents are always dead and like whatnot. But in Snow White, you really have like is like attempted to be murdered like several times throughout the thing, and the whole plot is like the queen's just trying to kill her because she's like, she can't be more beautiful than me. I mean, I get it, but still it might be too violent for children, just sort of based off that. But it's a sort of thing that it could get through the code because it wasn't really censoring for children, it was censoring for adults. But then you have like modern censorship that kind of takes the same ideals as like, I don't want my children to see this because it's bad, but is taking ideals from the Hays Code where it's like you kind of just didn't want anyone to see anything. So you get like, I don't want to go off the topic of movies, but you get something like the Comics Code Authority, which was the thing that censored comic books. And that was pretty based off like, oh, think of the children kind of ideals. And that kind of happened like later. It's about like, we can't show this stuff to children sort of thing. In that you have like certain problematic ideals where it's like, based off that, you think that comic books are strictly for children. And that's kind of a pervasive idea. And then the other pervasive idea that video games are just for children. So you get like censorship within comic books and video games, or like people complaining that a video game would have this when they really don't understand them as an art medium and just thinking that they're media for children just based off what they are. Same with any sort of animation. Like you see like animated TV shows that are for adults, like say a Rick and Morty or The Simpsons sort of thing. But then there's children's media, which is just strictly for children, like Gravity Falls, Steven Universe, stuff like that. And like any sort of age group in between. So I think the structure of the MPAA works good because it's sort of age-based, right? Because it's like, if you're like a 7-year-old, you wouldn't want to see the same sort of violence that you could kind of like understand better as a 13-year-old.
No, yeah, no, I gotcha. And going slightly off topic here, that really bothers me when people say, "Oh, you know, animated movies or animated shows or comic books, video games, kids movies are just for kids." I think that that's ridiculous. Like you mentioned,
Yeah.
Gravity Falls and Steven Universe, both of those shows, even though that those are age appropriate for kids, I think that those shows are for adults as well because they have very adult
Yeah.
themes, mature themes. In at some moments, in both of those shows, in my opinion, are a little too intense for like really little kids. But I think, you know, like both of those shows I love, and I'm gonna be 25 soon, so I'm definitely not a kid. But I've
Yeah.
watched those shows in its entirety several times, and I like when people say I don't want to get too off topic, but when people say that a certain medium is only for kids or a certain medium is only for a certain demographic, age group, whatever, that really bothers me because art shouldn't be art
Hmm.
shouldn't be limited. I consider movies, television, all that art forms, and art should not be limited to
Hmm.
just a specific type of person. And I think that yeah, I that so that really annoys me when people say that, oh, the kids movies are just for kids, so it's okay to have, poop and fart jokes, and oh, we can't discuss like really heavy stuff in these kids movies. Like, no, uh I don't know if you've seen Disney's Zootopia.
Yeah, I've seen Zootopia.
I really like that film actually, mainly for how well it portrays and addresses racism. And some people might say, "Oh, racism is too heavy of a topic
Hmm.
for kids to watch." Well, what if you're a young black boy or black girl being born and being
Yeah.
raised in a predominantly white community, and that's unfortunately it might be inevitable that this kid experiences, maybe not intentional, but will experience racism, and will need to learn more about how to address that, and how to fight against that. And like his parent, of course, there's his parents, but if he lives in a predominantly white community, where else I don't think he would really learn more accurately like how to fight racism. So where does he go next, besides his parents? Well, movies.
Hmm.
Movies are very influential, and I mean that in both a good and bad way. And personally, I think that Zootopia addressed surprisingly in a surprisingly mature and effective way, considering it's Disney. We'll talk more about Disney later,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I really liked Zootopia, and I'm pleasantly surprised that Disney, went really mature in terms of like how it symbolically addressed racism. And I think that people of like minorities, which I don't like that term either, but I'm using it because I honestly can't think of another term. But like people like minorities can like watch like Zootopia and be more informed. And a lot of people might argue, oh, like children should be innocent though. Children, like, the phrase, be seen but not heard.
Yeah.
I really don't like that phrase either. And I think that children, I mean, you don't have to completely like make them think that, oh, the world is a terrible place and ruin, their innocence and all that. But I think that, like through like movies like Zootopia, and shows like Steven Universe, you can really convey to kids, other realities out there involving with Zootopia racism, and involving Steven Universe realities involving homosexuality, which is definitely featured in Steven Universe, and how
Hmm.
to improve your mental health.
Yeah. So, yeah, things like that. There's like lots of children's media, like, and by that I'm just meaning like stuff that's for children, like on like a Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network at the times where they show their children's media stuff. So with like a Steven Universe or like Avatar: The Last Airbender, She-Ra's on Netflix, but that probably too, they touch on very complex ideas of like colonialism and racism that are like in a way for children. So it's, you could handle these themes in ways for children that are like age appropriate, and then like you do the same sort of stuff but like heavier with like different scenes like for adults. You talk about the modern like states of racism with Zootopia for children, but like adults you could just watch HBO's Watchmen, and they're both dealing heavily with racism and how that's like affecting our societies today, but in different ways for different age groups.
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
Watchmen's also really good in my opinion. But going back to Disney real quick, I'm kind of changing the subject here.
No, go
When
for
it
it.
comes to representation, Disney, when it comes to like censorship and representation, Disney kind of has really kind
Mhm.
of been frustrating me a lot lately because Disney, when it comes, specifically when it comes to LGBT for representation in their films, Disney's really trying to have it both ways, and
Yeah.
it's not working. Like, for example, they in Onward and the Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker and other various movies, they'll include really brief snippets of, uh, like in Star Wars, two women kissing, or in Onward, that lesbian one-eyed cop, and but they include like snippets like that to try to have a win with the LGBT community. But and yet in other countries, they can submit the film with those scenes edited out, and a lot of people, including myself, are frustrated the fact that Disney is trying to you know have a win in the LGBT community, and yet at the same time still appease foreign markets. And I don't know if you are one of those people that's like, frustrated with Disney or doesn't agree with Disney on this, or I'm just curious on like what your thoughts are on Disney not
So,
really choosing a side in this
yeah.
whole thing.
So what? Disney, very interesting case study. Well, for one, I'm going to say I don't agree with the way they're going about it, but that sort of, it's complicated for a number of reasons. So I'll kind of like jump in here. Disney has been a company for a long time, and you sort of like just see like basic Disney produced movies. But at this point in time, they're sort of nearly a media monopoly. They like own so many franchises and like studios and everything that if they wanted, they could really do whatever they wanted. But in the way that they're censoring their creators, it's sort of more about them trying to have it the best of both ways, like you said, so that they can like get people in, say, marginalized groups to buy their stuff in a socially acceptable way that's not going to alienate anyone on the other side. Because you see strange Disney project like from conservatives, they didn't want to see Finding Dory, not because the lead character was voiced by a lesbian, because there were two animated extras standing close to each other with a baby that you could read as gay moms, right? And they didn't want to see Beauty and the Beast, not because one of the actors in it was a gay man, but because they were going to have a gay character, like in the press where they said they would have a gay character. And then when you actually see LeFou in the movie, it's not very clear that that's what's happening. It's like, if you know about it and you're looking for it, he's like, Gaston, I've never been interested in anybody, and or like he like dances for like 1 second with a man at the end. And it's like, if you know it, you can see it, but otherwise it's not very clear. So that's the sort of thing they're doing. So again, I want to say I disagree with that, but they have a long, complicated history of a sort of queer representation in their media, and not a lot of it comes from like Disney top down. Like a lot of it'll be like individual people within Disney. It's like, so if we go back to the Hays Code, you can talk about queer coding, which is a way to like include a queer person in a piece of media without like explicitly saying they're queer. And this takes a lot of forms, and a lot of it has to do with trying to get queer characters through the Hays Code, which you couldn't do. Or if you did, they would have to be labeled a bad person and would have to die at the end, because like anyone who did something wrong had to be punished within the narrative of the story under the Hays Code. So you have a lot of early Disney villains appearing queer, and like a lot of queer people resonating with them. And then you have like later Disney, where past the Hays Code, you have something like The Little Mermaid. Ursula's character design was based expressly off of the drag queen Divine, who's very famous at the time. So it's kind of an obvious choice, and like anyone who looks at a picture of Ursula and looks at a picture of Divine is like, yes, I see it. And then in addition to that, Ursula herself is queer coded. So that's not really good queer representation, because you have like because it's not explicit to be queer representation. But like, yeah, Disney villains like Scar, Hades, like Jafar, name any Disney villain, you probably queer coded. And that's not representation. But then going back to the thing you said about them like trying to do it both ways, there's like individual people, like Disney owns Marvel, and a lot of the source material in the Marvel comics has queer characters, and they're sort of like, either they'll be missing entirely or that aspect of their character will be missing. But at the same time, people in the press tour, like, we tried to get this in, like, we tried to make it clear that Valkyrie was gay. And then supposedly that's the one time Disney like went to Kevin Feige and was like, no, this can't happen. And I mean, it makes some sense for Disney. It's like these movies are expensive and they want to make as much money as they possibly can. And they're a huge company. They have myriad of people just crunching the numbers on like risk assessment and whatever for how this is going to go. It's all about, with them specifically, it's probably all about money. And that kind of, since they are so prolific in their media and they own so much of like what's being made, I mean, it's hurting these groups of people that they're marginalizing.
I agree with you. Disney just, like I mentioned before, you know, Disney's trying to have it both ways because they're trying to make money and also, you know, be like, oh yeah, we're totally, you know, like, in support of the gays and all that. And, but going back to what you said about the Hays Code, what you said about queer coding, I think that the fact that queer coding meant that like only like villainous characters could be, you know, have like portray like gay stereotypes or be flamboyant or stuff like that really bothers me a lot. And also what really bothers me about the Hays Code is something that you mentioned earlier, is that because of the Hays Code, interracial couples couldn't be portrayed on screen, and you know, like certain things just couldn't be shown. And I feel like the Hays Code, I don't know, maybe it was originally formed with good intentions, but it, in my opinion, it ultimately turned out to be something that was actually suppressing or being prejudiced against a lot of minorities and marginalized groups. And I feel like the Hays Code, maybe it was created with good intentions, but ultimately, in my opinion, it turned out to be something that actually did more harm culturally than good. And I don't know, if you agree with that sentiment or not.
I'd say whether it was created with good intentions it's questionable. Like, I think they had to do something, but like what they created, whether it was good intentioned or not, is questionable. But I think it was in effect for years. I think I have the dates here somewhere. It was in effect from 1934 to 1968. And like before that, you were seeing movies with like representation for queer people, and you had like actors and actresses of color who were working like steadily working, who once the Hays Code went into effect, that was like they couldn't get jobs anymore because you couldn't have any interracial couples. And then you have like actresses at the time, like Mae West, her sort of style was very like raunchy, funny, sort of sexual jokes and kind of things, but she couldn't really work after the Hays Code. And there's many people whose careers were affected because of it. And in that, the narratives that were able to be told were cleaner in their portrayals. It's like you couldn't have like modern anti-hero kind of things. You couldn't feel any sympathy for the bad guy. And it's like you couldn't show anyone good doing any crimes, no matter what the reason. And then you couldn't show like portrayals of slavery. You couldn't show white slavery, but you could show black slavery. So they couldn't alienate the South. So like you get a lot of portrayals of like American slavery where it has to be positive, which is problematic in kind of like the ways that we view things today, because it was in effect for so long, and it during a time that was shaping how we make movies. Like the film language that came out of it still persists today, which is why we still get queer coded villains, even though a lot of creators won't realize they're doing it. It's just, these are the things that we expect to be villainous.
Which is really unfortunate, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. It affected like the landscape of film and still shapes it. Like even though it hasn't been in effect since 1968, you can like see the ripples of it, so to say.
Again, basically, like, yeah, basically, like what I said before, I think that the Hays Code ultimately did more harm than good, because I think that there are many kids who grew up and will grow up watching these older Disney movies, with villainous characters who are very flamboyant or have queer coding in them, and they might, see a real life gay person and just assume, negative things or negative stereotypes about them because of what they saw as kids. And I think that that's a really bad thing. And as someone who, it's interesting, because like as someone who is Christian and was raised in a Christian household, but also is liberal, it's kind of interesting to me, like my personal political opinions, and because of my opinions, like how I view movies. I don't know. I'm not, to all my viewers out there, I'm not saying that I have any like right answers, and I definitely don't have a 100% right answer, but I'm just expressing my opinions here. And in my opinion, the Hays Code was wrong, and I think that children shouldn't necessarily be exposed to more sex and violence, but should be exposed to more heavy, mature adult themes, to not to ruin their innocence, but to prepare them in a way for the real world, because the real world is very adult. One more point I want to make, and then one last question. One more point I want to make is that it is something else that frustrates me, at least in foreign markets, is that they'll edit out scenes with homosexuality or other stuff in it. And like in Samoa, they completely banned the movie Rocket Man, the Elton John biopic, and yet they also allow his music to be played there. And so what you mentioned earlier, Finding Dory, a lot of people don't want to see that movie because like a lot of people, there might be some people that are like, oh, Finding Dory is going woke now because they had two, gay moms in it, so I'm just going to stick with the original. Not realizing that the original Dory's voiced by Ellen DeGeneres, who is lesbian.
Yeah.
So like, I don't know. I just was wondering if you had any comments on like that kind of, for lack of a better term, hypocritical thinking from certain people or foreign markets.
Well, first we'll talk about foreign markets. Yeah, a lot of the modern censorship stuff that we were talking about with Disney, they usually blame the Chinese market, because the Chinese market is like, will censor anything gay. They're hard to get a film through. And if they want to get in that market, they can't show anything with LGBTQ plus themes. That being said, it's somewhat of an excuse that I feel like a lot of big movies will lean on, because they don't need to blame China when the West itself is like not the best at queer representation. That's one part of it. And then, but within that, you see like different markets will censor different things. Like say there's a TV show, How to Get Away with Murder, when it was shipped to different foreign markets, some of them were like cutting out the scenes with the queer couple about like a show whose like themes is like murder and getting away with it. It's not, it's like an adult show. It's heavy themes, but like, okay, we can't have anything this divisive, which I think it's fair that like different countries are going to have differing attitudes, because not fair in the sense that I like it, but like fair in the sense that not everyone's going to match America's morals, and like you can't expect that, and even if you did, it's probably not a good thing.
Right.
That being said, America ships out a lot of its media. Like America creates media, they'll ship it to a bunch of markets, and it's like it, if it's you're making something like that, that makes it hard to put in like certain things you want. So I want to say that that is complicated and I don't really have answers. I just feel that using foreign markets as an excuse is a bit lazy when you're trying to do representation. If you were actually trying to do representation and not just using it as an excuse for why you can't. Because if that's the only reason, that's not really the only reason you can't. Because that said, like, markets are like, they'll ban it maybe, or they'll cut something out. Like still, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try.
The other thing I want to ask you about is like, where exclusively we're talking about Americans now, specifically conservatives, well, not only conservatives, but for the most part, conservatives who are like, the sequel, where they talk about sequels like Finding Dory or remakes or whatever that will include queer representation or stuff that they don't agree with politically, and then they'll be like, oh, I'll just watch the original, and but the original features, you know, actors who are in real life queer or other stuff. So I was just wondering, like, your thoughts on that, you know, thought process that many of these people have.
It's interesting, and there's a lot of people like working in the film industry who are queer themselves, and they're like making work that's not necessarily queer, but like they are writing from their own experiences, and it kind of gets in there sometimes, you know. And then people don't pick up on it, and then like the queer audience will like pick up on it and be like, oh, that's interesting. And then like people saying like they'll protest something if it's like queer. So it's like when Ellen DeGeneres came out, she came out as a lesbian, and then she had the Ellen DeGeneres show. She came out as a lesbian on her show. I don't think her show would have been as protested if her character continued to be straight, because there was a queer character on the show before, but you can't have a queer main character. But then again, that was what, the 90s, so attitudes have changed a bit since then. So you see like people appreciating, like we talked about Rocket Man, people listen to Elton John's music, but like Rocket Man is like a very clearly queer movie with like a gay sex scene, and that's not even the gayest scene in the film, and people are like, oh no, that's way too much. Like, sure, I love Elton John's music, but I don't want to know anything about that. It's kind of weird, this weird kind of attitude where it's okay if you're gay, I just don't want to know anything about it, because you think it's all somehow perverse or too much for you for some reason, when really it's just anyone who's queer is just daily life. They're just going through life being queer. Like, I'm queer at the grocery store, I'm queer making dinner, and like that's going to color my perception of my day-to-day, but you seeing that is too much. They want sort of the plausible deniability. It's like, yes, they could be straight for all I know. It's sort of a weird ideal, and I don't understand it. I don't understand the ideas behind it.
Yeah, no, I don't. Yeah, it's kind of, it's weird thinking to me too, and you know, I'm not saying that, you know, like all conservatives are bad, or you know, like the conservative way of thinking is bad. You know, there are some conservative ideals I disagree with. I just find you know, like certain ways of thinking where a majority of people think that way just happen to be conservative. I just find those types of thought process a little foreign to me, but I
Yeah.
acknowledge that, you know, to other people, you know, it's normal. But I just, it just, it honestly, like politically, obviously, well, obviously, you know, politically, uh, you know, in America, at least in America, it's very, you know, like be careful where you tread kind of thinking right now, where so many people don't want to talk about politics. But I think whether we acknowledge it or not, all of us are constantly thinking through a political sense, whether it's through what like type of meat, not just with our beliefs, but through like day-to-day normal conversations, or what type of media we like to consume and show to our kids. I think that unintentionally we're constantly thinking politically, and because of that, I think that unfortunately, a lot of censorship in movies, in my opinion, could be classified as prejudice or bigotry. And not
Yeah.
everybody's gonna see it that way, you know. Like not everybody's gonna see China cutting out the one-eyed cop scene in Onward as a bad thing. Some people might, you know, think, oh, you know, they're just protecting their kids, or oh, you know, they're just doing what's normal in their country. But to me, I see that as, you know, something that a prejudiced and a move that's not right. And I want to ask you one final question before we wrap things up. Do you think that a lot of censorship in movies can also be classified as bigotry or prejudice against marginalized groups?
Yeah, I definitely think that. And especially like following the idea that you had pointed out about the they just don't want to show their kids, and it's like political, and they don't want to show their kids something political. And it's kind of like what I was saying before, when you're arguing politically about, say, like the queer community or something about racism, it's only political in the sense that you're removing yourself from it. But if you are queer or a person of color, that's just your daily life. It's just like what you're going through on a daily basis. And it's like, you were a kid, you might have kids, like not showing it to your kid doesn't make sense. Yeah. And so that's where it crosses the line into bigotry, where it's like, fine, you don't want to show kids sex and violence. I can agree with that. I completely agree with that. But like erasing like queer people or people of color through censorship, when it's just something mundane, like one-eyed cop scene, she's just like a person, like a one-eyed cop. She wasn't doing anything terrible, you know? She wasn't doing like, you know, this isn't like that deep. It's like, why cut that out for anything but bigotry?
Exactly. Yeah, no, me personally, I agree with you completely. But one final question that I have is, do you recommend there be any major changes in the MPAA or the movie industry and how they rate or censor movies or TV shows?
I'd like there to be changes. I don't think I can recommend something because I think the structure of the way that movies and TVs work right now, a lot of it's based off like getting the funding for things. And like, I don't think there'd be much problem with the MPA's rating if that didn't affect the way that films could be distributed. So you could have like whatever film you want, but you can't get it distributed. Like no one's going to see it if it's not rated or if it has too high of a rating. And that like affects the artists who are making them, or it could be. So I think my general problem is the way that it's working in that sense, is that the way it's affecting what films are going to be made, just because you can't get your film seen by anybody if the MPA is going to rate it too harshly, or you don't get a rating. Because again, like the MPAA is optional. You could just have your film not rated. But really, like, no one does that because you can't get it distributed without a rating that easily. So again, that's not something that I have a solution for.
Just like what you said, I don't really have any solutions either for exactly what changes could be made necessarily to the MPAA and or to like how Hollywood operates and communicates with foreign markets in general, because even though I want to go into that type of field as a career, I want to be a writer, director, producer. Honestly, like I'm not sure like how I'm gonna proceed, because I know that like America is a very diverse country, and not everybody thinks the same, and Hollywood too. Hollywood, like a lot of people label Hollywood as very liberal, but not everyone in Hollywood is liberal. Hollywood is a very complicated place to work. It ruined a lot of careers. It started a lot of careers, and I think that I think there are flaws in Hollywood and the MPAA and Disney and all this stuff in general. I do have things that would work. I do have solutions or ways to quote unquote improve the MPAA, Disney, Hollywood, etc. I do have solutions that would work for me, but these solutions I know would not work for everybody.
Mm-hmm. We're in an interesting place now with like modern ideas and like modern censorship and like trying to get things sold. So it's interesting to see where it's going to go, because I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm interested to see it. Like in the past, there's things like we talked about the Hays Code. That's very an interesting area of study, because there's so many movies that came out of it that really inform the way that we're still making films and consuming films. But then again, there's lots of movies that could not be made if the Hays Code wasn't in effect. Like, say, film noir is a whole genre that really wouldn't have happened if the Hays Code wasn't affecting the way those movies were being made. And like within that, it's really interesting to see the way creators are trying to get around censorship, or if they feel they're too censored, they try to sneak things in. And I like that. I see a lot less of that now. A lot of it's like the thing I was saying about it being an excuse. Like we're using like the foreign market as an excuse. We can't get anything in just because of that. And no one's really skirting around it or doing like anything creative to try and put in any sort of thing that they feel should be in the movie, but is like hampered because of what reasons. I mean, you see it in some places, like the children's media we talked about, because like that's heavily censored because it's for children. You have like stories all the time where creators will try to put something in, but the studio will be like, we don't think this is appropriate. But then in like some cases they're successful, like getting something through, or like some cases it's not like to do with like mainstream representation. It's just kind of like fun or whatever things that you put in like animated kids movies. So yeah, what I'd like to say is I wish I saw more people trying to get around the censorship that they're using as an excuse to like not include things.
I don't really have any more thoughts myself, so I'm gonna wrap things up now. And
Okay.
thank you for being on the podcast and for saying some really interesting stuff, half of which I didn't even know before. Like I had no idea that film noir was actually formed thanks to the Hays Code. And like I said before, thank you again for being on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, maybe I could have you again on a podcast if you're okay with that.
I would love to.
Awesome. And thank you all out there for listening to another episode of my podcast, Podcast Racing. I hope all of you are doing well, staying safe out there, and hopefully not too offended by either of our opinions. Thank you again for listening, and see you guys soon. Bye.